Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It is TJ and I.
Hi, everyone. You're welcome.
And our question for today is just like, what's our ethnic backgrounds? And does it even matter what our ethnic backgrounds are? Before TJ and I just share a little bit about our, heritages in this way, our ethnic roots. TJ, I'll play devil's advocate. Like, does this matter? Why are we talking about ethnicity?
I would say it definitely does matter, though I think I've realized that it mattered as over time, as I've hopefully become wiser, but also started to think more about the world and my place in it. So I would say it definitely matters. And part of the reason it matters is just to understand like belongingness and identity. You might say those things. But in another way, it challenges sort of dominant frames for engaging difference, but also engaging kind of socio-political systems. And we could talk about capitalism, of course, because capitalism is a pretty strong homogenizing force in the world, which has transformed how people relate to their place and who they are. So we could talk about that.
Can you elaborate on, like, by global capitalism, do you just mean the global market and the way that those forces are moving people around to seek jobs that, what do you have in mind?
It is the global market. Markets can exist without capitalism, but it's the way, it's the way it moves people around. Capitalism is sort of extractive, and that extracts people from places to shift them to the metropoles, the major sources of the big cities or the urban centers, which produce information and goods. Also, capitalism has made a dominant set of rules, like social rules that we follow, and ways of thinking about value and production and kind of the jobs people want, like just basic livelihood. Almost everyone in the world is now touched by that. So that's changed people's relation to space and time and people.
In sharing of your own background, will you be able to kind of share how you feel like those dynamics have affected your own families or cultural communities?
Yeah, I can. Yep. I have some thoughts. As we often say, there's a whole lot more to say in this particular topic of capitalism and ethnicity, but I'm hoping maybe we can start to draw out a few strands, even though that's not necessarily the main thing.
And if you've listened to some of our other episodes, we've been talking a lot around sexuality, in what ways can we talk about sexual identity or identify our sexual orientations, etc. And so in this, it's related because it's still talking about, how are we describing ourselves? How are we identifying ourselves with different social groups? And I think growing up in the U.S. in Christian context, that firmly Protestant America that says your identity is in Christ, there's a kind of a downplaying or a disregarding of ethnic identity, I think at times. And this is usually maybe unknowingly, maybe subconsciously at service to just serving whatever the majority culture is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to put some teeth on that. Can you give an example?
Well, I think part of that for you is America's relationship with ethnicity is complicated because the U.S., except for the indigenous peoples, are basically all immigrants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like everyone, that's not a common way of being a human in the world, in the sense that, or being a state or a country. There's a lot of states where people have been a member of that that community for 1,000 years, not a state, but a nation, right? The
Mm.
U.S. is immigrants. So you, for example, you are just you are homogenized into like the white racial category, right, in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
or European American, and that's true insofar as that category could be classified to you. But there's more to your story, as I know, and I think you'll say about that. When you're tied to dominance, you're like it's Protestant European American,
Mm-hmm.
like European American Protestant, which is the dominant as of now, the kind of the dominant. European American is closer to race, but it's not race exactly, but it's like a racial category you're put into. And I think that changes how, I think it really changes how your relationship to ethnicity and the way we're talking about, because if you're the majority, you don't have to think about it, right? But if you're not a majority, then you usually have to position yourself somehow in relationship to the majority position. But before we go on, can I just define ethnicity?
Yeah.
Just to make sure people know what we're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to give the most general definition of ethnicity. This is from, I'm going to use the Wikipedia definition, which is pretty good. So an ethnic group or ethnicity is a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups. For example, language, religion, place is prominent, descent, like genealogical descent. It could be customs. All of these things together usually show what we might call an ethnic group or ethnicity. Ethnicity can change over time as human social groups interact, intermix, as they go through different structural transformations around them. Like, for example, my European American ancestors, or my European American family members, who are also ancestors, but family members, they think of themselves as American, right? They think of themselves in their ethnic backgrounds too. Like my maternal grandfather's Irish, he thinks about it, or he thought about it. He passed away a few years ago. But I mean, American is the most prominent one. So it was a transformation. His grandparents and great-grandparents did not think of themselves as American, but over time it evolved. So I just want to be clear. Ethnicity is not a static thing necessarily, but it also evolves and changes over time for some people, or almost everyone, but it changes at different speeds. So yeah, that's what ethnicity is. So,
and thank you, TJ. I think maybe the question that's closer to like burning at my heart is, does ethnic identities necessarily lead to what we might call kind of divisive tribalism in a culture or in a larger diverse community such as the United States of America? Can you have an ethnic tribe without denigrating to warring tribalism? And my hope is yes, but we'll let's discuss that a little bit later. I'll just share briefly. Yeah, I grew up in Arizona, but I grew up, which is also in comparison to other places in the U.S., growing up in Phoenix, it's like the second round of living with a bunch of settler immigrants. The Americas are already predominantly settled by immigrants. And then Phoenix is this other very, it's one of the last, Arizona's one of the last states. Phoenix has just exploded over the last couple of decades. Very few people's parents, mine included, were actually born there. My dad was born actually in Ghana, Africa, but he himself is a kind of Swedish, Dutch, maybe a little German, Mennonite background. He grew up in Indiana, where my previous generations initially settled after leaving those areas of Europe. And that would have been, I think, in the maybe mid 1800s, that they settled in America, settled in Indiana, did some missions in Ghana, which is when my dad was born, and then met my mom at a Mennonite school in Indiana. My mom's family is also Mennonite, but at first it's kind of Russian Mennonite. It's actually kind of Ukrainian Mennonite, which is actually German Mennonite. So I've just been still trying to learn about this history, but the Mennonite communities in Germany Mennonites have a history of being persecuted by both general Reformed Protestants, by the Catholic Church, and by just state governments as well.
Mm.
And so they fled Germany and went to what is now Ukraine, but it's in some of the same, controversial, like, whose land is who, what governments, what nations are trying to claim this. And so during the Bolshevik Revolution around 1917 is when then my Mennonite family fled Ukraine and came to Canada. And since then have dispersed around different parts of Canada and the United States. So I've come from these kind of two different waves of Mennonite immigration into North America. And for those who don't know, I'll give a little more explanation of Mennonite. Some people are like, oh, actually I had a teacher in high school who was like, does that mean you're like Amish? Do you milk a cow this morning? I was like, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. Like I don't know where any cows are nearby. But they're actually not like so off base in that, one, there are Mennonites, kind of old or order Mennonites who wear plain clothing, have a very kind of just simple attire, simple way of living, and look like Amish communities, and are involved in farming in very much ways that they have a kind of an extended farming community, more rurally. In some ways there's a divide of like city Mennonites versus country Mennonites, but there's just a diversity, just like in every denomination, of how conservative or progressive. And so more on the religious history side, Mennonites came out of the Reformation time as part of the Anabaptist Third Way. While Luther, was protesting the Catholic Church, there were folks involved in the kind of Anabaptist who said, we're not even trying to reform the Catholic Church. We just think it's so off basis that we need to lead a new life of repentance, of faith and simple obedience. And this is primarily, I think, through like agricultural communities that are just seeking to follow the simple words of Jesus. And so Anabaptists is the larger umbrella that Mennonites fit under. And Menno Simons is one of the early leaders that the Mennonites specifically came after, but it became such a kind of tight-knit community and persecuted community as well that the Mennonites are an ethno-religious group. You could say you're Mennonite if you've, in a sense, converted or something, like have taken on more of a Mennonite theology or praxis in your life. But even if you're no longer a Christian, there's a very real way you can say, oh, I'm Mennonite. This is my ethnic background for the past couple centuries. And so it just makes it a very, it carries its own culture. It's a group of people who have a history of where they've had to settle, emigrate, what foods they bring with them, what languages that they've spoken. A lot of my mom's side especially, were speaking Low German. I don't know. I have to learn more of my dad's side. But so since growing up, I grew up in a small Mennonite church, was there for the first 18 years of my life, but didn't really know much history about it, and didn't know much kind of the theological convictions within it as well. And as I now kind of consider myself a Mennonitarian, a Mennonite Presbyterian, in that there are kind of theological postures or ways of following Jesus that really resonate with the Mennonite tradition that I want to hold on to as well. And I'm in a Presbyterian church. And so generally hold Reformed theology. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I won't waste time on that. But also I am trying to understand, as TJ has maybe said, I don't know if he said on the podcast, but he's like, you're not an individual, you're a person. And for listeners who are utterly confused by what in the world that means, the idea is that an individual is, pictures a person as someone who's isolated. It's like if you took a pea out of its pod and set it on like the kitchen table, you'd be like, oh, there's an individual pea. It is separated from everything. But that is actually, that has been taken out of its context to analyze it as an individual. Whereas a pea in its pea pod that's connected to, the branches and the vines and the roots and the soil and the air and the sunshine all around it is in a incredibly connected environment that you really can't understand that individual pea without understanding where it came from. What were the other peas that it shared its pod? What was the plant that it, the larger plant that it came from, and what kind of weather was it experiencing? Like there's a much larger history that explains who this pea is. And so the same is true of us as persons, that we are better understood in this organic relational reality, that we, you can't actually understand an individual human without understanding who their parents are, and often even who their siblings are.
And beyond.
and beyond. Yeah. Parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents, 7 generations is, deeply impacted. Even I think epigenetics is the study of genetic expression, and how there's this kind of extra layer that beyond your DNA coding, there's epigenetics that really influences how your DNA is actually then expressing itself as you develop. And so someone with the exact same DNA coding, if their parents have gone through different life experiences, they grew up in a polluted area, they grew up in a traumatized, childhood, that will have like epigenetic consequences on their children. It's just this biological way that we are much more connected to our parents beyond just we inherit their genes, but we actually, in a sense, inherit their experiences, inherit the context in which they grew up. And so part of who I am is related to the fears and stresses that my, great-great-grandparents experienced as they fled the Bolshevik Revolution. Even more so, how they held together as a loving community, as a family that took care of one another, as a larger, not just family, small family, but the larger Mennonite family, as they all cared for one another, as they banded together, as they sang songs of faith, hope, and love, and carried through in perseverance. Those stories that they went through, those ways that they cared for one another, are also, in a sense, embedded in my bones. And, those things don't overwrite or something. The person's, my growing up experience of my being a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, what I've read, who I've related to, it's not that, all those generations of experiences are somehow dictating something, but they're influencing. They're a part of me, and trying to just know my history, know why is it that my mom's side of the family is actually a lot more spread out than my dad's side of the family, which has stayed more local once they settled in America. I'm seeing generational trends differently even on those 2 Mennonite families, and I'm thinking about why that is, and how is that influencing me and my siblings in different ways. And yeah, and I hope that at my family reunions, where all my Mennonite second and third cousins and great aunts and uncles are getting together every couple of years, it's a really sweet time, really fun time. I'm hoping that there can increasingly be storytelling from the older generations, so that the younger generations know who we are, in part by who we have been. Who has come before us? Whose shoulders do we stand upon? What do we want to see from the past that we want to continue and cherish? And what do we need to see from the past and learn from and understand? And so all this is tied up to me, family heritage as part of this ethnic heritage. And I've been primarily thinking about that through Mennonite, more so because it's a more of a distinct flavor than simply German and Swedish, the larger nation.
You said it's
states.
an ethno-religious group, it's distinctive.
Yeah,
compared to others.
The German beer culture is something that like my Mennonite kin didn't really participate in. Now I think we, participate in American beer and wine culture in
Mm.
healthy ways. But yeah, that's not actually something in any of my more recent roots.
Also, I assume you had other customs like non-violence was talked about as
Yeah, I would say that's the
good.
one, like,
Yeah.
love of enemy and nonviolence
Mm-hmm.
was the one thing growing up that I kind of I understood was what it meant to be Mennonite. That
Uh-huh.
we are a
Sure.
community that doesn't go to war. And so it's been very interesting getting to know, other friends and their families, and of just realized the culture shock of like, oh, they have a bunch of family who's been in the military. But
Sure.
because of this history of nonviolence, pacifism, conscientious objectors,
Mm-hmm.
I just don't have really like any historic family connections of people being in the military. I think
Mm-hmm.
one of my great grandpas might have been a medic.
Okay. Which some, I'm understanding some Anabaptists accept that as a
Mm-hmm.
okay vocation to
Mm-hmm.
be like a supporting role in militaries as
Yeah, I
long
think
as you.
he might have been a Canadian medic, but the yeah. So yeah, we have our kind of own little flavor,
Mm-hmm.
and not every, you know, I would say a lot of my cousins and even my, like my parents, none of us are actually in Mennonite churches right now.
Okay.
But
Mm-hmm.
despite not, need being specifically a member of like a Mennonite denomination,
Mm-hmm.
I think even if we, you know, even if you completely, if one of my siblings were to completely like leave the faith, I would still encourage them in knowing where their roots are, and so that they can say this is where my roots have been, and it has formed me in these ways, but I want to now be more formed by XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
But to understand that story, I think is much more beautiful and much more. It's an integrated way to be a human,
Yes,
to
definitely.
integrate
Mm-hmm.
where you've come from. And I was actually just talking with my housemate about Moana, the Disney film Moana.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And it first feels like it's a movie that's just about kind of typical American. This isn't one of maybe it's not its primary theme, but there's this is a theme about self-discovery of this Hawaiian gal, and who, trying to find out who she is. Is she a seafarer? Does she stay on the island? Whatever. And it's actually a story of her discovering her more ancient roots. Her
Okay.
past parent, her existing like dad, who's the chief of their community, is kind of saying, "Hey, no, don't do this." But then she goes and finds caves drawings to find out, oh no, my people really were seafarers. And so her self discovery is actually by looking back even further to see who her people have been, and it's kind of finding out what is in her blood. And that's just I found that really special, because a lot of common media messages are just this really unrooted ways of just like, oh yeah, find out who you are, like take your I like personality tests generally, but take your personality test. What are your, interests? And a lot of it might get commercialized. And if we're talking about the way that the God of Mammon has, really changed to where they're like, hey, stop identifying with who your people are, but more identify with people who like to shop like you. What kind of
Yeah.
clothes do you like to buy? We,
Yeah.
that's just, we have our foremost like identity of who is the God that we serve. And that's partially why, I extra cherish my Mennonite heritage, is because it includes
Mm-hmm.
that history of people who've loved God. So there are some people who might have more torn feelings with the cultures that they come from, and more that they
Yeah.
feel like they need to separate themselves from. There are things that I take a step in a different direction, but there are things
Mm-hmm.
that I like, oh no, that's really great. I'm so thankful for this heritage of faith and prayerfulness that I've come from. Anyways, but just I find Moana, and as this kind of encouragement of like, yeah, like we are humans who come from more or less like, you know, large extended kinship networks, is something I think TJ would describe it as, these large families, extended families. And the last thing I'll say right now, I was up north at a event where some indigenous elders in Minnesota were talking to an audience that included other indigenous people, but included a lot of non-indigenous, settlers of the land, Americans who have just been here for a couple hundred years, rather than folks who've been here for thousands of years. And it was about, the event was around treaty rights, especially in resistance to the pipelines that were being built through treaty right lands in Minnesota. And I won't ever forget this elder who was talking about the way that, genocide has been perpetrated against indigenous communities and against their families, trying to wipe out who they are as a people. Mm-hmm. And if we, as non-indigenous settlers in America, are to ever be able to learn how to love the indigenous communities, love their culture, love their heritage, and support them in treaty rights just as a beginning, then we need to first know our own ethnic roots and and learn how to love those roots. Because how can we support the indigenous people in finding healing and restoration of their history that has been tried to get deleted in America if we don't even know how to do that in ourselves? And I recognize that for a lot of Americans, we're American mutts, and being American is,
by that he means mixed. To anyone who's listening,
is kind of, being American is now part of a formation of newer ethnic communities in a sense. But I think it's important that we do whatever work we can, and grieving as necessary of where has there been a sort of deletion of our own ethnic roots as well, in service to certain, either political or economic goals of the nation, but don't actually serve the flourishing of our communities and of ourselves.
I would also say, even to go off of what you said, my opinion, I think that if someone does not have that, they move in the world in a very different way. Like if someone does not have these roots, if they do not think about the past, place, like our commonality as human persons rather than individuals, it kind of centers them to do what they want, because they're accountable just to their desires and their will, rather than accountable towards larger projects of the good life or larger communal endeavors or a place that God placed you, like an actual physical place that you are supposed to steward well, So, yeah. And I'm glad, thank you for playing out the tension or the difference between individualism and personalism. And then the other one is communitarianism, which personalism is sort of a mediating position between the three. And in my opinion, is the most Christian one of the three. So, yeah, I appreciate that. We can talk more about them in the future, though. So,
TJ, can you share a little bit about maybe how you've been processing your ethnicity and the ethnicity of your ancestors?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm going to be a little bit general just to keep a certain boundary of anonymity. So I've mentioned this on podcasts before, but I have relatives from Mexico. They're mixed, as most people are, but they emerge from indigenous people and some of the Spanish settlers in the past. I also have relatives who are European Americans, pretty standard Europeans who moved through Canada to the US eventually, or just to the US over time.
Do you know what countries in Europe they came from? Was it quite a mix?
Yeah, for those relatives, they came from Ireland and Germany, predominantly. Yeah. And then I also have relatives in an African context, so that I also mention them as ethnic connections as well. So all those things come together to kind of form me. though they've had different measures of formation over time. Like different of those groups have formed in different ways. And I've been around some of them more than others. For example, I've not lived much of my life in Mexico. So that one, in some sense, is more distant to my ethnic formation, even if it's important to me, even if I have a connection, I keep it up. I've been considering in my life actually trying to go stay there for a time, like a longer time than I have in the past, just to make sure that I have some, like, a better connection than I currently do. And I've been processing it kind of, a lot of things you've talked about is what I'm talking about, the importance of roots, even in the way emphasizing roots and belonging as a person rather than as an individual is a prophetic witness. And that the elder you spoke with he's keying to that same point. I don't know if he's a Christian. She.
It was a woman elder of the indigenous community.
Okay, sorry. I don't know if she's a Christian. Maybe, I assume not. Okay, probably no. But she's keying on the same point. There's a prophetic witness in our particular age of our age of what rootedness means, or what we do with it, or what personhood is, rather than being an individual, which emerged, in European liberalist histories. So, yeah, I'm very brief. That's how I've been processing it. So, and you can always, it comes up so much, like this topic, and even in ways that are invisible or very implicit, it comes up in ways we think about kinship, in ways we think about, like, what's the good life, in ways we think about how we live, like what community looks like. Does our place matter? Even, are we going to be transient? Are you, for example, in your life, are you going to try to stay near your relatives? Or are you going to not stay near them? And of course, in this age, more than other ages, maybe in some places, some more people are divided. Like, we have relatives very far away, here, and there, So what do we do with that? And I'm not saying that these questions aren't complicated for some people. And as a personalist, rather than a communitarian, I'm not saying that some people don't have special vocations which may draw them away from their place of origin to some extent. But we still recognize this important nonetheless.
Go ahead. Can you express just what are some of those tensions?
Yeah. I would say part of the tensions are they're the basic tensions of life. Like, where do I live? Where do I spend my time? Where do I share time together with others? Because I'm still embodied in one time and space, So what I do with that, if I would have children, where would I raise them? How would I raise them? What languages do I want my children to speak if I would have children? What languages do I want to use in life? What customs do I use? What food do I eat? I think those basic things of life. And some people have no tension with that, right? Or they have minimal tension because their life is mostly, as far as I know, is in one place. Like, for example, a lot of people in the US just speak English because that's what their situation is. They eat the common foods of, like, European Americans or whatever. They do the common things. They envision life in a certain way. But I have to envision life in multiple different keys because I'm accountable to different people who have different expectations from different places. So, yeah, that's the tension. It's hard for me, and I think for many, it's hard to resolve and put the pieces together sometimes.
It hits on just how much American freedom, we're about our rights for liberty, which are great. But the paralysis of choice that we face. I know a lot of people who prefer shopping at Aldi compared to larger grocery store in our areas, Cub, there's various others, just because there's just so many fewer choices. And then you can be happier about finding, what type of milk you want without having to search through the 5 different brands of milk or something. And there's a reality that you can find a certain type of freedom in actually having, once you've placed those limits upon yourself. I feel more free shopping at Aldi than going to Costco or something. And I'm using this as a parallel to, as we relocate and interact with different cultures, different ethnic communities, that we are and it's forcing upon ourselves more and more choices. Who do I want to be? How do
Yeah.
I want to form myself and my household? Which place do I want to invest in? I feel a little bit of grief of that my parents are in Arizona and I'm in Minnesota, and I've chosen to start planting roots here.
Mm.
But I asked my mom, like, "Are you okay that I'm doing this?"
Mm-hmm.
And more or less, she gave me the blessing. She said, "It would be selfish of me to hold you back from where the Lord's calling you." Part of me also just doesn't feel selfish because Phoenix, as I mentioned, is such an unrooted place for so many people who've settled there, that
Mm-hmm.
people are there for a generation or two,
Then they leave.
and then might leave. And so it's not like we have a long history there. It's not like my family has owned this land for many generations. It was heartbreaking when my grandparents sold their house that had been there for, over 30 years. And which is kind of crazy. Like, that's how much that was like, oh, I was born and I'd go to my grandparents, and that was the place. And I would go over there for pizza every Tuesday night and bagels every Saturday morning. And I have so many memories at this home over my life. And that's just 30-ish, 30 or so years in one
Mm-hmm.
place.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for people who've been in a land for, hundreds, let alone thousands of years? And then to see that, especially if it's forcibly taken away, a big part of, maybe we'll have another episode where we get different voices on to talk about rootedness in place, because as you mentioned, a defining characteristic of ethnic communities is often, well, what place have they dwelled in and cared for?
Yeah, it's true. Place really shapes people in their lives. And there's a lot of research on place, and I won't go into much, but there's a lot of research about place and how people engage place and how it changes human beings.
Yeah, I mean, you just
including,
think, I was just going to say, I grew up in a desert versus now that I'm planted in the Midwest. Farming practices are very different in those two different environments. And so if you were to imagine different families living in those different environments for centuries, there would be a lot of different community knowledge and customs. And there's even books about generally just warm culture, cold culture globally, that we see that around the world, there's certain differences that you notice depending on which climates they are in, about how they relate to time and how they relate to hospitality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to bring in this kind of counter quote. So we'll link to this article. It's about Hitchens' anti-racism. And Christopher Hitchens in this talks about how ethnic tribes are a threat to like a peaceful universalism. Here's the quote. But how much more addictive is the familiar old garbage about tribe and nation and faith? End quote. And he, you can hear the tone that he sees these things: tribe, nation, faith. We would especially think around ethnicity related to tribe background, though he has both that in mind, of like ethnic tribes. I think he has
nation
that
can
in
be
mind
ethnic too,
more particular. And
I mean, both can be ethnic, yeah. But
though we often talk about, ideological tribes that happen in America as well. And he would just see that as a, cropping up of that same old garbage. And he calls it addictive, like he sees like the human propensity to find belonging in these smaller communities, these smaller identity sets, as addictive garbage. Like we're just, dwelling in our own crap. And yeah, so how would you respond to his critique that, like, hey, you being addicted to this stuff, to making these a prominent part of your identity, is just destroying our ability to find, a global peace, a solidarity amongst all human beings that aren't divided by tribe, nation, and faith, but that we can come to each other as individual humans who are all part of this grand human experiment game, and we're just have this grand equalizing identity rather than having to divide ourselves up. Do you think there's any merits at all to like what he's pushing against? We'll start there.
I mean, yeah, in a certain sense, there's a merit because some of these things have divided people in a way that produces violence that as Christians we would condemn. So that does exist. I will say that their atheistic political orders have also committed violence against people. Usually, and they had a sort of universalist, we're all one, like all one China, and we're atheists, or we're all one whatever, and we're atheists. They also have done violence. I will say that. I have lots of thoughts on this. I think, in my opinion, Christians, he's advocating for one type of universalism, which emerges out of European Enlightenment liberalism, right? Christians are they represent another form of universalism, which I think, in my opinion, can better hold the goods that he's trying to get, but also retain the goods of diversity that he wants to get rid of. It is because I'm not opposed to the tribe, nation, and faith as this fellow Hitchens is opposed to in this particular quote we're considering. But he is right. I also appreciate another strength. There is an addictiveness sometimes, right? Like there have been Christians who occasionally have been divided. There have been Christians, okay, I won't say occasionally. They've been divided in a certain sense by being from different nations. Divided is so strong, but they've been different nations, and sometimes they commit violence against other Christians. Mm-hmm. That seems like a reprehensible, like that's not what God wants, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think
I know.
My history is that. Like,
I know.
I am literally part of, the church I'm now part of has its, denominational history in the church. And like, I assume this happened in Scotland. I guess I don't know if any of my particular ancestors were in the Scottish region, but generally the reformers persecuted my Mennonite ancestors.
Yeah.
And we could say that that's a way that, like, well, if they just saw that they were, all humans, and rather than identifying strongly with their, faith convictions and as communities, then they could have avoided all that violence.
And I'm not opposed to the violence, but I think from the reformers' side, I think charitably, the Mennonites they were rebaptizing. So they seem to be just essentially destroying the social order. And they thought they were heretics. So that was the rationale for violence. I'm not saying it's a good rationale, but some human social orders in the past especially tried to really get people who had accepted common authorities, accepted common theologies, like generally try to live in the same way, right? We're coming from a position where that's less common. A lot of the current social orders, they say, okay, choose what you want. Like, what do you want is your own will. So, yeah. Yeah. So there's like tension. I'm not pro the violence, but there's that tension, I think, too. So.
I think growing up, I would interpret, I would have probably spoken against national identities, but I thought of national identities as, the nation states as a higher priority identifier than tribes, ethnic tribes. And so if I would hear about, these warring African tribes fighting each other, as like, well, why don't all these Ghanaians just come to peace and understand that they're all Ghanaians? How would you respond to young David in his push for people to deny their tribes and just embrace their Ghanaian unity?
I have lots of thoughts. First thought, I'm going to use ethnic nation rather than ethnic tribe. Just I think tribe can be negative sometimes, but okay. So ethnic nation, and then there's so much to say. I also changed over time when I lived more of my life in Africa on the continent, when I engaged my relatives, all this stuff. So I would say that the what you call it, the states, the current states are social constructs, right? Like the U.S. is a social construct. It has a history. It has a history of homogenizing to make everyone to gain sovereignty over all the peoples in the general area that it now occupies. So did Ghana, for example. Ghana was a British colony, and the British took it over. They had pre-existing ethnic nations who were doing their own state-making processes, but the British came in a time where they were able to take everything over and then just said, this is Ghana. And so, but the people weren't necessarily, it was an imposition of a foreign power. It didn't emerge from their own state-making processes. And in some sense, their ethnic nations, they perpetuate certain ways of being rooted, a rooted personhood, right? They probably had violence. They probably had things that we would think are wrong, but they still were promoting like rooted ways of life. Did the state do that? I'm skeptical if they did that. But I think a lot of the violence, in my opinion, not all the violence, but some of the violence emerges from the very fact that these people were put into states which were imposed by them, and then they fought over the power that the state offered. Does that make sense? So there's a lot to say, but one challenge, it's not just because like they're ethnic groups, like ethnic groups are just violent, but it's often because in the context they're in, like in the state structure that they're now in, violence emerges because the different groups are competing for power in that imposed structure. Like trying to get the goods that the British people could give them, or trying to get the power that the British officials had, or whatever. That's one thing. Over time, I became, as I said, my political beliefs shifted a lot because I was also similar to what you were talking about, where I was trained to think of the state, the current state, as the most important form of ownership, of political belonging. But I changed when I became more serious about my Christian commitments, because like obviously the church is the most important form of social political belonging. And then I changed also as I started engaging with people who still remember their roots and their ethnic backgrounds. And I said, well, that's more important, the roots and ethnic backgrounds. So then that made me push contemporary states as like much lower than the other two, because I think the states are, there's our definitions of states, but one definition is they're the ones that control how violence happens, and they claim universal sovereignty over their space. And they usually participate in the international order, which has no final authority. It's just how the states relate to each other. So I was like, well, they're very powerful now. States are so powerful in our contemporary world just because they've taken power over time from other parts of the civic order, like the church or ethnic political authorities. So it made me skeptical over time, but those are some of my thoughts. I think there's a lot to say, but that's some of my thoughts. So,
yeah, thanks. So we're making these kind of claims at some level, what it means to be human.
Yeah, totally. Mm-hmm.
And we grow up in such we grow up looking at the globe, staring at a bunch of nation states,
mm-hmm.
focusing on that more so than the topological, like patterns on the globe, and more important than, well, what languages are spoken where, what cultures, what other ethnic nations. But what captures kind of my vision biblically on this is Revelation 7:9, that we do believe in this Christian universalism of this, like in Christ, all peoples can find their unity, that it doesn't erase tribes. Well, let me just read it. I'll read the NASB version. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all the tribes, peoples, and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. And so it's this just like everyone from around the globe, where people from every community around the globe are gathered at the throne. And it's interesting that it names nation, tribes, peoples, and languages. But that word nation is actually where we get the Greek of that is ethnos.
Mm-hmm.
It's referring to this ethnic nations, not nation states in their political order under Rome, that kind of nation. But there were, Roman people, but in that Roman nation state,
It was an
Uh,
empire. It wasn't a nation state, but yeah.
yeah, sorry. Well, okay. You know more technically. Within the Roman Empire,
Mm-hmm.
there are lots of ethnoses, lots of
Mm-hmm.
ethnic nations. And and there's this kind of validizing that when people are coming to the throne of Jesus in Revelations, they don't lose that identity, but it's actually something special that we are, many tongues, many languages are coming to worship Jesus.
Mm.
They don't all learn a new heavenly tongue. They don't leave their tongue. They don't lose their earthly ethnic, identity in order to join Jesus's new people group. They are a new people group. They are part of they have a citizenship that is in heaven,
Mm-hmm.
but it's an incorporative one
Yeah.
that is
Mm-hmm.
unitive.
Yeah.
It's not deleting it.
No.
And yeah, we wanted to branch into this conversation just to start to lay some groundwork. You guys can hear from us on where we're coming from as we want to further explore what does it mean to be rooted in ethnicity, and can we do this in a way that promotes peace
Mm-hmm.
rather than increasing divisiveness.
Yeah.
And what I see happening in multiple ways, which we'll kind of get in at different angles in future episodes, is the way that in the name of peace, in the name of even social justice, in the name of economic equality, or that violence is actually being done to ethnic communities.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying, oh, well, we need to group people in this way, or we need to treat everybody the same in these ways. And they pursue those goals in ways that tries to ignore who these people are and who they have been.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that, yeah, the market forces that just focus on our, identity through consumption.
Mm-hmm.
We are actually being incentivized to, leave our communities, leave our places of cultural formation, community belonging, in order to pursue maximizing our economic gain, what I would call serving the god of mammon. And we have those choices of what we're going to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
And if we only value investing in things that make sense through larger market or political, success metrics,
Mm-hmm.
then it will naturally, I think, do a lot of poisoning, or it's uprooting us. We are forgetting who we are
Mm-hmm.
in ways that I think has, even just like mental health impacts is one way to measure it on a smaller level.
Sure. I definitely think that, I like that what you said. I think the Christianity represents like a both and for universalism and particularism, kind of as similar to the Revelations passage you said. It's both. In contrast to Hitchens, as we mentioned earlier, I don't think that we need to get rid of our particularities, but it's about how we relate them together to the universal kingdom of God's kingdom, right? And what he calls people to do and people to live, and the flourishing we're supposed to pursue. But I can't deny there's complexities in this. There's different judgments. So that's part of the hardship. So I'm really happy we're moving into this conversation. This is part of the DNA of our podcast, to think about this conversation. Communion and shalom, as we say. So we're going to engage this, and I think for our listeners, there'll be complexity along the way. We don't have all the answers, though we kind of know some of the foundations we have, and we have more to say on them in future episodes too. But we're glad you're joining us on this journey to think about this as one of the strands that we want to engage in this podcast. And yeah, please keep listening. We have more to say over time.
We'd love if you guys have any, what are your questions around this, around ethnicity, around how does ethnicity and race relate to each other? How do we pursue racial justice while developing ethnic roots? I think these are some of the questions that I have, and I would love to hear y'all's questions as well. How do we maintain ethnicity in really transient American life and global life? Please send in your questions.
Yeah, we'd love to hear them. So everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. If you're interested in supporting this podcast, you can check out our Patreon. It will be in our show notes. And also we have an Instagram as our main social media platform. So if you do Instagram, please follow us, and you can maybe more easily get news from Instagram. So yeah, well, thank you everyone. We appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.